January 6, 1982, one of the deadliest blizzards in Wyoming's history. That night, two young women vanished from the town of Jackson Hole, outside the Teton County Sheriff's Office. The thermometer read 20 below zero. Winds howled at over 40 miles an hour. Snow fell so thick that streetlights turned into faint, glowing halos in the white darkness. By morning, one of the women was found frozen in a snowbank. Near her hand lay something strange, an orange sock. Just one. At first it seemed meaningless, a lost piece of clothing in the chaos of the storm. But 6 months later, when the second woman's body was discovered miles away, she was still wearing the matching orange sock on her left foot. And that's when police realized the truth. They had already met the killer. They had rescued him from the same storm that killed his victims. He had looked them in the eye, accepted their help, and walked away free. Madison Grant was 29 years old, a woman with auburn hair that fell past her shoulders and a laugh that filled whatever room she entered. She had moved to Jackson Hole 3 years earlier with her husband Connor Davison, drawn by the promise of mountain living and the tight-knit community that thrived in the shadow of the Tetons. Madison worked as a bartender at the historic Wart Hotel in downtown Jackson, a place frequented by locals and tourists alike. She was good at her job, remembered everyone's drink order, knew how to diffuse tense situations with humor, and had become a fixture in the town's social fabric. People trusted her. People liked her. She seemed to float through life with an ease that others envied. But Connor worried constantly. Madison hitchhiked frequently between their small cabin on the outskirts of town and the hotel. She insisted it was safe, that everyone did it, that Jackson Hole was not like other places. Connor disagreed. He had seen too much, heard too many stories, understood that danger did not always announce itself. So he made something for her. He spent weeks in his small workshop behind their cabin, carefully crafting a solid brass keychain. It was heavy, nearly 3 ounces, with sharp, angular edges that could be gripped firmly in a fist. The design was intentional. It could be used as a weapon if she ever found herself in danger. Madison laughed when he first gave it to her, said he was being paranoid, said nothing bad ever happened in Jackson, but she carried it anyway, clipped to her belt loop because it made Connor feel better. On the evening of January 6th, she would use it exactly as he intended, but by then it would already be too late to save her own life. Kayla Turner was 21 years old. With light brown hair she usually kept in a ponytail, and a smile that people described as infectious. She had arrived in Jackson Hole only 8 months earlier, in May of 1981, leaving behind a difficult family situation in Nebraska and seeking a fresh start in the mountains. Her older sister Cindy had been skeptical about the move, worried that Kayla was too young, too trusting, too naive about the world outside their small hometown. But Kayla was determined. She found work almost immediately as a housekeeper at the Snow King Resort, a job that did not pay much but came with the promise of mountain views and a community of other young people chasing similar dreams. Kayla loved the work. She loved the town. She called Cindy almost daily, her voice bubbling with excitement about the skiing, the people she was meeting, the life she was building. At Christmas, Cindy had sent a care package filled with home-baked cookies and a pair of hand-knitted orange wool socks. Kayla had called to thank her, laughing about how bright they were, how they reminded her of home. She wore them constantly under her work boots, a small connection to the family she had left behind. On January 6, 1982, she put them on before her morning shift. She never made it home that night, and for 6 agonizing months, Cindy would call the sheriff's office every single day, asking for updates, begging for answers, clinging to the hope that her little sister might still be alive somewhere. The day started with no warning signs, no omens, nothing to suggest it would end in horror. Kayla finished her morning shift at Snow King at 11:30, her hands raw from scrubbing bathtubs and making beds. She clocked out, waved goodbye to her co-workers, and walked to her noon doctor's appointment at the clinic on Mercell Avenue. The appointment was routine, a follow-up for a persistent cough she had developed in the cold, dry mountain air. The doctor prescribed antibiotics and told her to pick them up at the pharmacy on Broadway Avenue. Kayla left the clinic around 12:45 and began the short walk downtown. The storm was building. Dark clouds rolled over the Tetons like a thick blanket being pulled across the sky. The temperature was dropping fast. By the time Kayla reached the pharmacy, snow was already starting to fall in heavy wet flakes. She went inside, paid for her prescription, and stepped back out onto the sidewalk at approximately 4:45 in the afternoon. The storm had intensified dramatically in just those few minutes. Visibility was dropping. The wind had picked up. Howling down the empty street, Kayla needed to get back to her rental near Teton Village, about 7 miles away. Hitchhiking was common in 1982, especially in tight-knit mountain communities where everyone seemed to know everyone. People trusted each other. They helped each other. Kayla stood outside the pharmacy with her thumb out, snow already accumulating on her shoulders. Several cars passed her by, their headlights cutting weak paths through the white chaos. Then a truck slowed down and pulled over. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and opened the door. His name was Ryder McAllister. He worked at a limestone quarry in the hills outside town. His face was weathered from years of outdoor labor, his hands calloused and strong. He smiled at her, said he was heading in her direction, said he would be happy to give her a lift. Kayla climbed in, grateful to be out of the storm. She thanked him. She made small talk about the weather, about how fast the blizzard had come on. McAllister nodded, agreeable, friendly. He drove slowly through the snow, his truck's tires crunching on the fresh powder. And then, somewhere along that dark, empty road, everything changed. McAllister's demeanor shifted, his smile faded. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, Kayla noticed. She felt the atmosphere in the truck turn cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. But by then, it was too late. They were miles from town. The storm had erased the world, and no one knew where she was. But what happened next inside that truck would haunt investigators for nearly 40 years. At approximately 7:50 that same evening, Madison Grant hugged her friends goodbye at the $1 Million Cowboy Bar, a local institution famous for its bar stools made from real saddles. She had been there since about 6 o'clock, unwinding after her shift at the Ward Hotel, laughing with coworkers, sipping a beer. The storm outside was raging, but inside the bar it was warm, loud, filled with the kind of camaraderie that made small-town life feel safe. At 6:21, Madison had stepped outside briefly to use the payphone. She called Connor, her voice bright despite the howling wind. She told him she was fine, having fun, and that she had arranged a ride home. She would be back soon. Connor, half asleep on the couch in front of the television, mumbled an acknowledgement and told her to be careful. Those were the last words they ever exchanged. Connor fell back asleep, the TV playing to an empty room. When he woke just after midnight, the television was showing static. The cabin was silent, and Madison was not there. Connor sat up, instantly alert. Something was wrong. Madison was never late. Never. If she said she would be home soon, she meant it. Connor pulled on his boots and jacket, grabbed his keys, and drove out into the blizzard. The roads were nearly impassable. Snow had drifted across entire sections of highway. His headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. He drove slowly toward town, scanning the roadside, looking for any sign of her. Nothing. He went to the Teton County Sheriff's Office and tried to file a missing person report. The deputy on duty told him he had to wait 24 hours, standard protocol. People sometimes stayed with friends, got caught in the storm, lost track of time. Connor wanted to scream. Madison was not like that. Something was wrong. He knew it in his gut, a cold, terrible certainty that made his hands shake. But the deputy would not budge. Connor returned home, unable to sleep, pacing the small cabin, staring out the window at the relentless snow. At 4:30 in the morning, the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. Connor grabbed it before the second ring. It was a local rancher named Tom Hewitt. He had been out checking his fence line and had found something strange blown up against a post. Madison's driver's license. Connor's heart stopped. He asked where. The rancher gave him directions. Connor was out the door before the call even ended, his truck fishtailing on the icy roads as he raced toward the location. He found the spot easily, and there on the side of the road, half buried in a snowbank, was Madison's distinctive blue backpack. He knew that backpack. He had given it to her for her birthday 2 years ago. Connor stopped the truck, left the engine running, and stumbled through the snow. He grabbed the backpack, his breath coming in gasps, panic flooding his chest. Then he saw them. Two other items lying nearby: Madison's right glove, the leather stiff with cold, and a tissue crumpled, stained dark. Connor picked up the tissue, his hands trembling. Blood. It was soaked with blood. He stared at it, unable to process what he was seeing. The snow fell around him, silent and indifferent. Somewhere out here in this frozen nightmare, something horrific had happened to his wife. What Connor did not know, could not possibly have known, was that the blood on that tissue did not belong to Madison. It belonged to the man who killed her. The search for Madison began at first light on January 7th. Word had spread through the small community overnight. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, people who barely knew her all gathered at the sheriff's office, ready to help. They organized into teams, equipped themselves with skis and snowshoes, and fanned out across the area where her belongings had been found. The temperature had barely climbed above zero. The wind tore across the open fields with a fury that stung exposed skin within seconds. But no one complained. Everyone knew what it meant when someone disappeared in conditions like this. Time was running out. At 3:15 in the afternoon, a man named Derek Foster, a ski instructor at Snow King, spotted something dark near the base of Teton Pass. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree branch or an animal carcass. But as he skied closer, his stomach dropped. It was Madison. She was lying face down in a snowbank, her body partially covered by the fresh snow that had continued falling throughout the night. Derek called out to the others, his voice cracking. Within minutes, a dozen people had converged on the location. Someone radioed the sheriff's office. Connor Davidson, who had been searching with another group farther north, heard the transmission on a handheld radio. He dropped to his knees in the snow, unable to breathe, unable to think, his world collapsing in on itself. By the time investigators arrived and secured the scene, the sun was beginning to set. Agent Jim Hardkey from the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation led the forensic team. He had been doing this work for nearly 15 years, but the sight of Madison's body, young and frozen in the snow, still affected him deeply. He approached slowly, methodically documenting everything. Madison was fully clothed, her jacket zipped, her jeans intact. There were no obvious signs of sexual assault, though an autopsy would later confirm its zip ties dangled from her left wrist, the plastic stark white against her blue skin. Hardkin knew immediately what those zip ties meant. Someone had intended to restrain her. Someone had plans for her that she had managed to escape, at least partially. Near her outstretched right hand, Hardkey found the brass keychain Connor had made. It was covered in blood, frozen solid. Madison had used it exactly as her husband had intended. She had fought. She had fought hard enough to wound her attacker, hard enough to escape his vehicle, but she had not fought hard enough to save her own life. Hart bagged the keychain, his hands steady despite the cold. This was evidence. This was the key to finding the killer. About 10 feet away, partially buried under fresh snow, Hardku spotted something else, an orange sock. It was clean, relatively new, hand-knitted with bright orange wool. He picked it up, examined it, turned it over in his gloved hands. It did not match anything Madison was wearing. Her socks were white athletic socks, visible at her ankles. So where did this orange sock come from? Was it Madison's? Had she been carrying it? Hardick had no answers. He bagged it as evidence and made a note in his report. It was just one of those mysterious pieces of evidence that sometimes appear at crime scenes, things that make no immediate sense but that investigators hold on to, hoping they will eventually reveal their significance. He filed it away and continued processing the scene, unaware that the orange sock was the single most important piece of evidence he would find that day. Yet something even more disturbing was unfolding, something investigators would not discover for another 2 days. On January 8th, a co-worker at Snow King Resort called the sheriff's office. Kayla Turner had not shown up for work for 2 days. Kayla was reliable, never missed a shift without calling. Her co-worker was worried. Deputies traced her last known movements. She had been seen at the pharmacy on Broadway Avenue late in the afternoon on January 6th. After that, nothing. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. She had simply vanished into the storm. Search parties were organized, but the blizzard had buried everything under feet of new snow. Tracks were impossible to find. Witnesses were scarce. Kayla's sister Cindy called the sheriff's office every single day, begging for updates. There were none. Weeks passed, then months. Cindy refused to give up hope, but deep down she knew. Something terrible had happened to her little sister. Then, on July 3rd, 1982, nearly 6 full months after Kayla Turner disappeared, a 12-year-old boy named Michael Brennan went fishing with his father at a remote creek near Hoback Junction. It was a bright summer day, warm and clear, the kind of day that made the brutal winter seem like a distant nightmare. Michael waded into the shallow water with his fishing pole, looking for a good spot to cast. His father was upstream, baiting his own hook. Michael rounded a bend where the creek narrowed between moss-covered rocks and stopped. There was something in the water, caught against a fallen log. It looked strange, unnatural. At first, his young mind tried to make sense of it. A store mannequin maybe, or Halloween decorations someone had dumped. But as he stepped closer, as the current shifted and the object rolled slightly in the water, reality crashed into him with sickening clarity. It was a person. A dead person. Michael screamed. The sound tore through the peaceful canyon, echoing off the rock walls. His father came running, crashing through the brush, thinking his son had been hurt. When he saw what Michael had found, he turned away and vomited into the bushes. Then, forcing himself to stay calm, he grabbed his son and half-carried him back to their truck. They drove directly to the nearest ranger station, the father's hands shaking on the steering wheel, Michael crying in the passenger seat. Sheriff's deputies and investigators arrived within the hour. Agent Jim Hartke, the same investigator who had worked Madison Grant's case 6 months earlier, stood on the creek bank staring down at the body. Even after years of working homicides, even after seeing things that haunted his sleep, this sight affected him deeply. The victim was female, young, badly decomposed from months in the flowing water. Identification would be difficult. Fish and natural decay had taken their toll. But something about the location nagged at Hartke's instincts. Hoback Junction was roughly 23 miles from downtown Jackson, in the opposite direction from Teton Pass where Madison's body had been found. There was no obvious connection, but Hartke had learned over the years to trust his gut, and his gut was screaming that something about this case felt eerily familiar. The autopsy took place the following morning. The medical examiner, a stoic man named Dr. Walter Chen, worked methodically. He determined that the victim had been shot in the back while running downhill toward the creek. The trajectory suggested she had been fleeing from someone on higher ground. The bullet had never been recovered, likely lost somewhere in the wilderness or carried away by the water. The state of the victim's clothing raised immediate and disturbing red flags. The zipper on her jeans was completely torn apart, destroyed with enough force to suggest violent intent. Her shoes were on the wrong feet, as though someone had hastily redressed her after death. Hartke stood in the autopsy room, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He suspected sexual assault, but the extensive time in the water made forensic confirmation impossible. Tissue degradation had been too severe. DNA testing, still primitive in 1982, offered no useful results from the decomposed remains. It took another full week to positively identify the body as Kayla Turner, the young housekeeper who had disappeared on January 6, 1982, the same day Madison Grant vanished. Dental records provided the final heartbreaking confirmation. When Hartke learned who she was, when he realized both women had disappeared on the exact same day in the same small town, his heart rate quickened. This could not be coincidence. Not in his experience, not in a town as small as Jackson Hole. But he needed proof. He needed something concrete, something tangible that linked the two murders beyond suspicious timing. That proof came during the autopsy, in a moment that would forever change the trajectory of the investigation. As Dr. Chen carefully documented and removed Kayla's remaining clothing, Hartke noticed something on her left foot, an orange sock, orange wool, hand-knitted, partially decomposed but still distinctly recognizable. The color was unmistakable, even after 6 months in the water. Hartke stared at it, his mind racing. Something clicked in his memory. An orange sock. He had seen an orange sock before. Recently. Where? Then it hit him like a physical blow. Madison Grant's crime scene. The mysterious orange sock found near her body, the one that had made no sense, the one he had bagged and filed away as unexplained evidence. He grabbed his briefcase with shaking hands, pulled out the Madison Grant case file, and flipped through the evidence photographs. The The orange sock from Teton Pass. The same bright orange color. The same knitting pattern. The same approximate size. In that single instant, everything clicked into horrifying clarity. The sock near Madison's body 6 months ago had not belonged to Madison at all. It had belonged to Kayla Turner. Which meant Kayla had been inside the killer's vehicle first, hours before Madison ever climbed in, which meant the killer had picked up Kayla in the afternoon, driven her to Hoback Junction, assaulted her, shot her in the back as she ran for her life, and left her body in the creek. During that assault, Kayla had lost one of her bright orange socks somewhere in the killer's truck. Later that same evening, when the killer picked up Madison near the bar, and she fought back with the brass keychain, when she kicked open the door and leapt from the truck in a desperate bid for survival, her feet had made contact with the loose orange sock lying on the floor. Or she had inadvertently kicked it out into the snow during her escape, never knowing it belonged to another victim, never knowing it would become the thread that tied two murders together. The orange socks were not random. They were a timeline. They were proof. One killer had hunted twice in one night. One man had destroyed 2 lives in the span of a few hours during a blizzard. And now, finally, investigators understood they were not looking at 2 separate cases. They were looking at a monster who had moved through Jackson Hole undetected, picking off vulnerable young women like prey. In that instant, Hardkey understood. These 2 women who disappeared on the same day, who were found months apart in completely different locations, had been killed by the same person the killer had picked up Kayla first. During the assault, she had lost one of her orange socks inside his vehicle. Hours later, when he picked up Madison and she fought back, she had kicked that loose sock out of the truck during her escape. The sock was the link. The sock was the proof. Investigators now knew they were looking for one man, a man who had killed twice in one night, a man who had hunted along the highways of Jackson Hole during a blizzard, picking up young women who were simply trying to get home. But who was he? And how had he managed to disappear without a trace? The investigation intensified. Detectives interviewed hundreds of locals. They looked at everyone who had been out driving that night. They checked alibis. They re-examined evidence. The brass keychain, the blood on the tissue, the orange socks, everything pointed to a single killer. But his identity remained maddeningly out of reach. Connor Davidson, Madison's husband, became an early suspect simply because investigators could not fully verify his alibi. He had been home alone, asleep, when Madison disappeared. No one could confirm it. The suspicion devastated him. People in Jackson began to whisper. Some refused to speak to him. Some believed he had killed his own wife. Connor continued to live in the same small cabin, enduring the stares, the rumors, the unspoken accusations. It was a special kind of hell. He knew he was innocent, but he could not prove it. And the real killer was still out there, free, living his life as though nothing had happened. For nearly 40 years, the case went cold. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away. Evidence sat in boxes in a storage room, untouched, waiting. But in early 2020, something changed. Detective Sergeant Garrett Lawson of the Teton County Sheriff's Office heard about a breakthrough technology called genetic genealogy. It was a method that had recently solved several high-profile cold cases across the country. Genealogists could take DNA from old crime scenes, upload it to public ancestry databases, and potentially identify suspects through family connections. Lawson pulled the old evidence from the Madison Grant case. The tissue with the blood, the DNA that had been extracted years earlier but had never led anywhere. He sent it to a genetic genealogy company in Colorado. And then he waited. Months passed. On January 9, 2021, his phone rang. The genealogist on the other end had news. 2 names, two potential suspects. Brothers. One had never lived in Wyoming. The other had been a miner in the area for decades. His name was Ryder McAllister. He still lived in Jackson Hole. He had worked at a limestone quarry for over 30 years. He owned a small auto repair shop. He was well known in the community. A familiar face. Someone people trusted. Lawson ran a background check and discovered something that made his blood run cold. On the night of January 6, 1982, Ryder McAllister had been rescued from a snowstorm on Teton Pass. His truck had become stuck in a drift, and he had used his headlights to signal SOS in Morse code. A local sheriff flying on a commercial flight overhead had spotted the signal through the blizzard and radioed dispatch. Fire Chief Blake Anderson had driven up the pass to help. When he arrived, he found McAllister, a co-worker from the mines. Anderson later recalled that McAllister had a large, fresh bruise on his face. McAllister claimed he had fallen while walking around in the snow, trying to figure out how to get unstuck. Anderson thought nothing of it at the time. It was a brutal night, people got hurt in storms. He pulled McAllister's truck free and both men went home. No one suspected a thing, but that bruise had not come from a fall. It had come from Madison Grant's brass keychain when she struck him in the face during her desperate fight for survival. Authorities had rescued Madison's killer just hours after he murdered her. They had stood next to him, helped him, sent him home. And for 40 years, he had lived freely in the same town where his victims had died. Lawson felt sick. McAllister had been right there, right in front of them, and no one had known. The realization was almost unbearable. On January 15, 2021, Lawson obtained an arrest warrant. Officers moved in quietly, surrounding McAllister's property at dawn. When they knocked on his door, he answered calmly as though he had been expecting them. Perhaps he had, perhaps, after nearly 4 decades, he had always known this day would come. He was taken into custody without incident. At the sheriff's office, McAllister initially denied everything. But when confronted with the DNA evidence, his story began to fall apart. He admitted picking up Kayla Turner. He admitted picking up Madison Grant, but he claimed both incidents were accidents, misunderstandings, moments that spiraled out of control. Detectives did not believe him. The evidence told a far darker story. The trial began in October 2022. Prosecutors laid out the timeline in meticulous detail. McAllister had picked up Kayla Turner near the pharmacy around 4:50 in the afternoon. He had driven her out toward Hoback Junction under the pretense of giving her a ride. Instead, he assaulted her and shot her in the back as she tried to flee. During the assault, she lost one of her orange socks in his truck. Later that evening, around 7:50, McAllister picked up Madison Grant near the $1 Million Cowboy Bar. He attempted to assault her as well, but Madison fought back harder than he expected. She used the brass keychain Connor had made and struck McAllister across the face, splitting his cheek open. In the chaos, Madison managed to jump from the truck. She kicked open the door, and as she did, the loose orange sock left behind by Kayla flew out onto the snow. McAllister chased Madison into the blizzard and shot her. Then he returned to his truck and drove toward Teton Pass, where he became stuck in the snowdrift. It was only hours later that authorities rescued him, completely unaware of the horror he had just committed. Connor Davison testified at the trial. He spoke about the brass keychain, about the years of suspicion, about the pain of being accused of murdering the woman he loved. His voice cracked as he described finding her backpack on the side of the road, the blood-soaked tissue, the unbearable wait for answers that took 40 years to arrive. Cindy, Kayla Turner's sister, also testified. She talked about the phone calls to the sheriff's office, the desperate hope that her sister might still be alive, the crushing moment when she learned the truth. She spoke directly to McAllister, asking him why. Why had he taken her sister? Why had he destroyed so many lives? McAllister sat silently, expressionless, offering no answers. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On November 7, 2022, Ryder McAllister was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, he glanced back once at the families. His face revealed nothing. No remorse, no regret, just a blank, empty stare. Connor Davison stood outside the courthouse afterward, surrounded by reporters. When asked how he felt, he paused for a long time before answering. Relief, he said, but also anger. Anger that it had taken so long, anger that McAllister had lived freely for 40 years while Madison lay in a grave. Anger that people had suspected him, doubted him, turned their backs on him. He had spent half his life under a cloud of suspicion, and no verdict could give that time back. But at least now, people knew the truth. Madison had fought, she had marked her killer. And even though she could not save herself, she had left behind the evidence that would eventually bring him to justice. Cindy echoed those sentiments. Kayla had been running for her life, and even in her final moments, she had been trying to escape. The orange sock, The small piece of evidence that seemed meaningless for so many years had been the key that tied everything together. Without it, the cases might never have been connected. Without it, McAllister might have remained free forever. Cindy held up a photograph of Kayla, young and smiling, taken just weeks before her death. "This is who he took from us," she said. "Not just a victim, a person, a sister, someone who mattered." Detective Sergeant Garrett Lawson stood nearby, visibly emotional. He had worked cold cases before, but this one had affected him differently. Perhaps it was the length of time. Perhaps it was the proximity of the killer, hiding in plain sight for so many years. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that McAllister had been rescued, helped, and sent home by the very authorities who were trying to find him. The case raised uncomfortable questions. How many other cases had similar answers buried in old evidence? How many killers were still out there, blending into their communities, confident they had gotten away with it? Lawson did not have answers, but he knew one thing. Technology was changing the game. Genetic genealogy had cracked this case wide open, and it was solving others across the country. Cold cases that had been considered unsolvable were being reopened. Families who had given up hope were getting answers. Justice, even decades late, was still justice. But for Connor Davidson, the victory felt hollow. Madison had been gone for 40 years. He had never remarried. He had never moved on. The cabin where they had lived together still stood, though he rarely went inside anymore. Too many memories, too much pain. He thought about the brass keychain often, the tool he had made to protect her. It had worked in a way. She had used it exactly as he intended. She had fought. She had wounded her attacker, and that wound had eventually led to his capture, but it had not saved her life. And that was the part Connor could not reconcile. He had tried to give her something to protect herself, but it had not been enough. The orange socks became a symbol of the case. Kayla's mother had knitted them with love, a simple Christmas gift. Kayla had worn them proudly. And in death, they became the thread that connected two murders, two victims, two families forever bound by tragedy. Cindy kept the photographs of those socks in a small album. She looked at them sometimes, trying to make sense of it all. How could something so innocent, so ordinary, become the key to solving a double murder? It felt surreal. But it was also a reminder that small details matter. In investigations, in life, the smallest piece of evidence can unravel the biggest mysteries. Ryder McAllister never explained his actions. He never apologized. He never showed remorse. Psychologists who evaluated him noted a complete lack of empathy, a detachment from the consequences of his crimes. He viewed himself as the victim, someone who had been unfairly caught due to modern technology he could not have anticipated. In his mind, he had beaten the system for 40 years, and that was a point of pride, not shame. His family refused to speak publicly, devastated by the revelations. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, helpful. No one had suspected him. No one had seen the darkness lurking beneath the surface. That perhaps was the most disturbing part. Evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor, a coworker, a familiar face in a small town. Someone you trust, someone you help in a snowstorm. The investigation officially closed in early 2023, but the scars remain. Jackson Hole has changed significantly since 1982. It has grown, modernized, become a destination for tourists and the wealthy. But for those who remember the winter of 1982, the town still carries the weight of those two murders. Locals talk about it in hushed tones. The case is part of the town's history now, a dark chapter that cannot be erased. Memorials for Madison Grant and Kayla Turner were placed near the locations where they were found. Flowers are left there occasionally, small tokens of remembrance for two women whose lives were stolen in a single brutal night. Connor Davidson eventually sold the cabin and moved to a different state, seeking a fresh start. He never gave interviews after the trial. He wanted privacy, peace, a chance to grieve without the cameras and questions. Cindy stayed in Nebraska, but visits Wyoming once a year on the anniversary of Kayla's death. She stands by the creek where her sister's body was found and says a prayer. It is her way of staying connected, of making sure Kayla is not forgotten. The pain never fully goes away. It dulls with time, becomes manageable, but it never disappears. Both families learned to live with that reality. Justice was served, but it did not bring their loved ones back. Detective Garrett Lawson retired in 2024, but the McAllister case remains his most significant achievement. He gives talks now at conferences and law enforcement seminars about the power of genetic genealogy and the importance of never giving up on cold cases. He tells the story of Madison and Kayla, of the orange socks in the brass keychain, of the killer who was rescued from a snowstorm. It is a story that resonates with investigators everywhere, a reminder that perseverance matters, that evidence, no matter how old, can still speak, that victims deserve justice, no matter how much time has passed, and the story serves as a warning. Predators are patient. They hide in plain sight. They count on time, eroding memories, destroying evidence, dulling the urgency of the search. But technology is catching up. DNA databases are growing. Genetic genealogy is improving. Cold cases are being solved at an unprecedented rate. Killers who thought they were safe are being arrested decades after their crimes. The message is clear. There is no statute of limitations on murder. There is no escaping the truth forever. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. On a cold morning in January 2025, exactly 43 years after the murders, a small gathering took place in Jackson Hole. Survivors, investigators, and family members came together to remember Madison Grant and Kayla Turner. Candles were lit, stories were shared, tears were shed, and in that moment, despite all the pain, there was a sense of closure. The women were not forgotten. Their names would live on. Their courage in fighting back had ultimately led to their killer's capture. And while their lives were tragically cut short, their legacies endured. Connor Davidson attended the memorial. He stood quietly at the back, unwilling to draw attention to himself. When it was over, he walked alone to the spot where Madison's body had been found. The snow was deep that day, much like it had been 43 years earlier. He knelt down, brushed the snow aside, and placed a single white rose on the ground. He stayed there for a long time, lost in thought, remembering the woman he had loved, the life they had planned, the future that was stolen from them. When he finally stood and walked back to his car, he did not look back. It was time to move forward. Madison would want that. She'd been a fighter, even in her final moments, and her fight had not been in vain. The brass keychain Connor made for her is now kept in an evidence locker, a permanent reminder of her courage. The orange socks are there too, preserved as the critical link that solved the case. These items, once ordinary objects in ordinary lives, have become symbols of something much larger. Symbols of resilience, of justice, of the truth that eventually comes to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. And they serve as a testament to the fact that even in the darkest moments, when hope seems lost, when time seems to have erased all possibilities, the truth is still out there, waiting to be found. Ryder McAllister will spend the rest of his life in prison, a place where time moves slowly, where regret has room to grow. Whether he feels that regret remains unknown, but it no longer matters. His freedom is gone. His secrets are exposed, and the families of his victims can finally rest, knowing that the man who destroyed their lives will never hurt anyone again. The story of Madison Grant and Kayla Turner is not just a story about murder. It is a story about resilience, about the relentless pursuit of justice, about the power of small details, and the importance of never giving up. It is a story that reminds us that even in the coldest, darkest nights, even when all seems lost, there is still hope. There are still people fighting for the truth, and in the end, the truth will always find a way to surface. The blizzard that swept through Jackson Hole on January 6, 1982, buried two young women in snow and silence, but it could not bury the evidence they left behind. It could not bury the courage they showed, and it could not bury the truth. 40 years later, that truth emerged, cold and undeniable. And Ryder McAllister, the man who thought he had escaped justice, learned that some debts can never be outrun, some crimes can never be forgotten, and some victims will never be silenced.